You might wonder why talk about poverty in Calgary and why talk about business in the context of poverty. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about this paradox of poverty in the midst of fairly significant prosperity in Calgary. Talk a little bit about where poverty comes from and then see how we can engage the business sector as a meaningful partner in poverty reduction. So, if I can make this work, there we go. Prosperity. I probably don't need to remind any of you in this room of some of the really good things about Calgary. We've had really incredible GDP growth over the last decade or so, a little bit of a bump over the last few years, but even through that, we weathered that extremely well. If you look at employment growth in the Calgary economic region over the last 15 years, it's almost doubled what it was. We've got the lowest unemployment rate in the country and the highest average income. So obviously we have some tremendous strengths here. And that leads many people to say, well, you know, poverty is not really an issue in Calgary. And in fact, it is. If we look at the number of people who are living in poverty in Calgary, it goes up and down. But currently there's about 120,000 people in the city who are living below the poverty line. We might think that economic growth would be the solution to that problem. And while it certainly is an important factor, if you look at GDP growth over the same time period, even at the height of our boom, where we were posting record GDP growth rates of almost 12%, which is almost unheard of, our poverty, the number of people in poverty in Calgary didn't decline significantly. It did go down. And part of the challenge here is that one of the reasons for that is that most of those who are living in poverty are already working. So simply providing more opportunities for employment doesn't necessarily provide people with a route out of poverty. We also know about income, and that, as I said, Calgary has the highest average income in Canada. If we look at income trends over the last number of years, we see certainly a significant trend upwards, say for the last 15 years or so, which is good news. The problem, of course, with averages is that they can be skewed. We've all heard about the 1% and so on. Just to make that graphic, though, when we're looking at average income, certainly there's been significant growth at the top of the income spectrum. So the income of the top 1% has more than doubled over the last number of years. The challenge is that for 90% of the population, incomes have barely moved. So yes, we have seen significant income growth in the average, but for most people, the wage picture has been relatively flat. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the challenge here is not just about people, well, about 10% of the population that's living below the poverty line. There's a challenge for a very, very significant percentage of the population who are experiencing a fair degree of financial stress. If we look at expenditures of households compared to income, rather striking that in 2009, and this is actually an improvement from a few years before, close to half of the population of Alberta was either just breaking even or was spending more than they were earning. And for the bottom 20%, they were spending 122% of their income. And consider now that if the poverty rate is 10%, 20% are overspending. We've got a significant swath of vulnerability that extends far above the poverty line. And we see that reflected in some survey data that we did as a city. We partnered with the United Way a few years ago to ask what were the issues that were top of mind for people. And over half of Calgarians said they were concerned about not saving enough money for the future. Almost half were concerned about having too much debt. Almost a third were concerned about not having enough money for housing. And 1 in 5 were concerned about not having enough money for food. Again, significantly more people experiencing very significant financial stress, significantly more than those that are living in poverty. Now consider that these people are also largely working and are probably our employees. So imagine the stress that people are bringing with them to the workplace every day. So it was our task to figure out what to do about this. And one of the clues here is if we look at the persistence of poverty. Poverty is not something that I think we tend to think of the person who ends up in poverty and is there for generations. And in fact, poverty in Alberta isn't like that. For the most part, if we look over a 5-year period, 83%, so very large percentage of the population, weren't touched by poverty. About 3% were persistently poor. Those are your chronically poor. And the rest were in the middle, on average in poverty for 2 years or less, falling into poverty and working themselves out, perhaps falling in again and working themselves out. What we want to do is make sure they don't end up down in the bottom 3%. How do you do that? We need to build resilience in people above the poverty line so that people don't fall below it, and that's how we prevent poverty. And then, of course, support people who are below the poverty line to get out as quickly as possible. And that was our challenge. So the Calgary Poverty Reduction Initiative was an initiative launched by the mayor in partnership with the United Way a number of years ago. And we have a vision of a city where no one is deprived of the resources, means, choices, and power to acquire and maintain self-sufficiency while being able to be an active participant in society. And our task was to develop a long-term plan to significantly reduce poverty and enhance the well-being of all Calgarians. So it's not just about people below the poverty line, it's about everyone. So we set out and we asked people, well, what would that city look like? And we got a lot of interesting answers, many words that you wouldn't necessarily think of in terms of poverty. Things like city would be diverse, inclusive, hopeful, happy. There'd be less stress. It would be safe. People would have choice. It would be vibrant, and so on. So then we said, well, if we are to build that city, how would we go about doing that? And we said we need to have a new conversation, not about poverty, but about building a great city for everyone. And we said there's three paths to that. One is building assets, so that's working with the assets we already have, and we know that we have significant assets. We need to build resilience in families, in institutions, in organizations, including our business sector, and we need to build trust. And that's the foundation of that great city. We landed on 4 goals. I'm just going to focus on one of them, which is most relevant to us today, and that is that everyone in Calgary has the income and assets needed to thrive. So there's 2 routes to that. One is about doing business differently. We already know how to do business, and we do it very well. But is there a way that we can do business differently to get a greater social return? And the other is about building assets. Doing business differently, we talked about the power of community economic development and supporting that form of economic development, but also about working with our corporate sector around developing and promoting inclusive business practices. And we had a very good, a number of sessions with stakeholders from the business community, 2 half-day sessions about a year ago organized by Calgary Economic Development, where stakeholders came together and they talked about what could the role of business be in building this future. We also had another session organized by the Chamber back in March with some key business leaders who also wrestled with that question. So I want to share with you some of their ideas that we built into this strategy around inclusive business practices. The first thing they said is there are things we can do with our workforce. Businesses already do a lot of things very well. They're great contributors to the United Way. They do a lot of community investment, but there are things that we can do in the way we do business as well that can have a significant impact. Flexible workplace practices. Allowing that flexibility in the workplace that allows people to balance work and family responsibilities can actually bring more people into the workplace. So those who may not be able to participate in the labor force now can, and you have a win for business because you, in a tight labor market, you're increasing the labor pool available to you. Investing in employee supports, investing in childcare, in transportation, in various programs even to provide food or housing for employees can go a long way, both to supporting employees and increasing their productivity for you, as well as in helping them meet their basic needs. Of course, paying living wages and benefits is important. Having a diversity focus in our HR practices so that we bring in groups of people that might be excluded from the workforce otherwise, and providing training and mentorship opportunities. There's also things businesses said we can do with our stakeholders. One is having a local CSR focus. I think a lot of times when we think of CSR, we're thinking about what we do with our international supply chains and international operations. We can take that same approach and focus it on how we do that locally within our own community. And we can do that through our procurement policies by driving that change into our supply chains. A lot of us do it very well with our own employees, but we can increase the impact of those policies if we start to spread them out into our supply chains. The City of Calgary, we have an ethical purchasing policy where we have established performance standards that we are working with our suppliers to meet on the social and environmental goals. Having diversity on boards increases the perspective around the table, increases your productivity, but also brings other voices into decision making that otherwise wouldn't be there. And of course, recognizing foreign credentials. Lastly, with our community, a lot of corporations are doing this very well. Can they mentor others who need that support to learn how to do this with their corporations, with their supply chains? Being involved in initiatives like this, working with the business sector was a great opportunity for both us and the business sector to learn from each other. Supporting employee community involvement in volunteer work and so on in the community. Providing work experience opportunities so that people can get, particularly perhaps newcomers to Canada who require that Canadian experience. And lastly, aligning our community investments for impact. There is a lot of corporate philanthropy. Is there more that we could do to work together as a sector to magnify the impact of that? So those were some of the suggestions which we incorporated that came out of those workshops, those stakeholder workshops with our business partners and driving towards some outcomes. So ultimately what we'd like to see is within 10 years that 95% of Calgarians are above the poverty line, but also that Calgary has the highest employment quality in Canada. So we're not just known for having jobs, we're known for having good jobs. That 95% of those who are working are earning a living wage. That we have the best credit risk score in Canada so that our families and households are financially resilient and have savings there to support them in times of crisis. And that we don't have any concentrations of poverty. So in conclusion, what we're saying is that we've done a lot of work over the last number of decades around alleviating poverty, but we need to do something different if we're going to prevent it and ultimately end it. And that sounds like a daunting task, but it is possible. There are a number of cities across the country that are doing this and are making great strides. And those that have been most successful have had meaningful partnerships with the business community to do that. Key message is that we're all vulnerable to poverty. Anything can happen to any of us at any time and can land us there. And by the same token, then, we all benefit by creating that great city where poverty doesn't have the opportunity to thrive. And lastly, we believe in Calgary, of all places, there is enough for all. It's not a zero-sum game. We can grow the kind of economy and build the kind of city where we all can share equally in the prosperity that we have here. So thank you very much. And if you'd like to follow the work of the CPRI, there's our contact information. Thank you.